Welcome to the G Lab. This is Mr. G, of course, and it's time for us to look into the wonderful world of plants and the chemical reactions that they go through every day. It's pretty amazing what they do without us even thinking about it very often. So that is, of course, the process of photosynthesis. The word photo means light, and the word synthesis actually means making stuff. And so photosynthesis essentially is making stuff with light. And that's what plants do. They create new compounds using light as an energy source. If only we could do that. It'd be so cool. So photosynthesis. The amazing thing about photosynthesis is that you start off with a tiny little seed that grows a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, and if you just give it a few years, and kaboosh, you get this enormous tree. Now, where does all that stuff come from? I mean, what is it that makes up all this tree? This is certainly not, if we think about this before the chemical reaction, over here is a seed, and then after the chemical reaction as an enormous tree, this is not conservation of mass, right? I mean, where did all the mass come from to make this tree? It's crazy. So, where does it come from? Well, here's the deal. Here's the ingredients. The only really ingredients you need to make a plant are two things. You need carbon dioxide, which we as animals breathe out, add a little bit of water, a little energy from the sun, and gaboosh, you have this, an enormous tons and tons and tons of wood and leaves and roots and everything that makes up a tree. Where does it all come from? Well, I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of weird. It doesn't come from the soil. If it used up the soil, there'd be a giant hole underneath every tree. It actually creates all it needs out of the atoms found in carbon dioxide and in water. So what are those atoms? Well, let's take a look at the chemical formula for photosynthesis. It starts with carbon dioxide, and again, we can get that from animals breathing out. Also, anytime you burn something, whether that's forest or coal or whatever, you can produce carbon dioxide. Volcanoes also produce carbon dioxide. So there's plenty of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for plants to use. Add some water, and that's pretty easy to find around our atmosphere, around the Earth. And then some sunlight. That's fairly abundant as well. And what do you produce? Well, what is it that actually trees are trying to produce? They're trying to produce sugar, essentially glucose. And if you tap into a maple tree, the sap that comes out is essentially just sugar. And in fact, sugar is the food that trees and any plant really makes in order to build itself. Trees are built of sugar. Now they've rearranged that sugar and make it into more complex forms like carbohydrates and starches and lignin and all kinds of other things that actually make the tree itself, the leaves and the bark and the wood and all that. But sugar is essentially the basis that makes up all plant life out there. So I make sugar, glucose, and then they have oxygen left over, and the oxygen then is released back into the atmosphere. So let's take a look at what the chemical formulas are for that. For carbon dioxide, of course, it's CO2. For water, H2O. For sugar, C6H12O6, that's glucose, the most basic form of sugar. And then oxygen is O2. Oxygen tends to hang out as a pair of oxygen atoms bonded together. So, if we're going to, in class, of course, we built some atoms out of beans, and we used the red ones for carbon atom, and the white ones were the oxygen atoms, and the green ones were hydrogen atoms. And so if you go ahead and build a carbon dioxide molecule, well, it's got one C, so that's a one carbon atom, and O2 means that it's got two oxygen atoms, so kind of drop those babies in there, and that there is one carbon dioxide molecule. Those three atoms there would bond together to form a compound called carbon dioxide. Water, if you're going to build a water molecule, you've got H2, so two hydrogens. We used little green peas for that, and one oxygen. So you've got one white bean there representing oxygen, and so there's H2O. There's what water looks like. They'd be all bonded together. Now, if you're doing making glucose, sugar, you got 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. to make one molecule. And of course, a molecule of oxygen would just be 2 oxygens stuck together. If you really wanted to make sugar, for instance, look like sugar, you would arrange it in just that formation right there. That's kind of how all those atoms bond together and what they would look like for a molecule. In our case, we just kind of stuck them in some trays. So one tray, each one of those trays, what does that represent? You can go and answer that now. This is like Dora asking you a question, kind of awkward. One tray represents one molecule. Okay, each of those is a compound, a molecule of each of those things. So from which reactant does sugar get its hydrogen atoms? In other words, it's got 12 hydrogen atoms. Where does it get those from? Does it get it from, it's got to get it from one of these reactants over here, and it's got to be water because that's the only one with hydrogen. So it gets its hydrogen atoms from water. From which reactant does sugar get its carbon atoms? Well, where does the carbon have to come from? That's right, carbon dioxide. It's the only place you're going to find it. So carbon dioxide gives the carbon atoms to make sugar. And where does it get its oxygen atoms? Well, it gets those from either water or carbon dioxide. Probably both, actually. Excellent. And then finally, is this equation balanced? Does it have the same number of atoms on both sides? Over here in the reactants, you can see we've got 1 carbon. Over here, 6. So obviously not balanced. The number of hydrogens way off, number of oxygens way off. This equation is nowhere close to balanced. Somehow all of these other atoms here were just created out of nowhere. But we know that because of the conservation of mass, that matter can't be created or destroyed. Atoms just get rearranged. So something's wrong here. This equation is not quite complete. So let's try and figure this out. Conservation of mass has to apply, so we need to do something to change this. So this guy here, Antoine Lavoisier, who was French, I believe, back in the 1700s, he's the guy who really came up with the idea of the conservation of mass, and therefore balancing these equations became kind of important. And he's looking at this going, wait a second, this doesn't look balanced. The reactants are way lighter than the products over there. So what can we do? Well, here's one solution. You could just get rid of a bunch of carbon. And okay, here we go. Carbon is now balanced. We've got 1 on each side. But then what does that make this molecule here? C1H12O6. What is that? That's not glucose. That's not any kind of sugar. That's probably not even any molecule at all. So you can't do that. You can't change the molecular formula of a molecule because it won't be that molecule anymore. A plant would look at that and go, yeah, no, that's not going to work. I don't do whatever that is. I need sugar. I need to make sugar. So that doesn't work. What if we said, okay, we need 6 carbon on each side? Well, let's just add 5 more carbon over here to the carbon dioxide. So what do we have now? Well, we have C6O2. What is that? That's not carbon dioxide. And the plant's going to be not able to breathe in carbon dioxide because that's not carbon dioxide. So what do we have for a solution? We have to have 6 carbon on both sides. Well, the solution comes when we start to think outside the molecule. If we add more molecules of carbon dioxide, in fact, if we have 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, we can then have a total of 6 carbon atoms on the reactants side of the equation and 6 carbon over here. All right, so our carbon's balanced. Let's move on to hydrogen and see if we can balance that. We've got 12 on the product side, but only 2 over here. Where did they all come from? Well, obviously we need more water molecules. So if we have a total of 6 water molecules, we now have a total of 12, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 hydrogen atoms. Now we're balanced for hydrogen. It's looking pretty good. So we've got all the stuff we need. And look at this, we've even got plenty of oxygen to make these 6 oxygen atoms to make sugar. But wait a second, we're not balanced. We now have way too many oxygen over here. We can't just get rid of them because that would change the number of molecules, or it would just tear apart these molecules. We can't just change the numbers up here. So what do we have to do? We've got all these extra ones. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 oxygen molecules, and only 8 over here. We need 10 more. Can't just add 10 here and have O12. That's not a real molecule. So what do we need to do? in order to balance this thing, we need to add 5 more oxygen molecules for a total of 6 oxygen molecules, therefore making us balanced on both sides. Yay, so happy. And the way we record that on paper anyway, if we're not using beans, is we would put a big 6 in front of the CO2 to show that there are 6 carbon dioxide molecules. We put a big 6 in front of the H2O to show that there's 6 water molecules. We put, what do you think, a 1 here? We actually put nothing in front of the sugar because it just shows that, no, there's just 1. You could put a 1, but we don't. And over here with oxygen, you put a big 6 in front of that to show that there are 6 oxygen molecules altogether. Now, looking at this here, the number that goes in front of the molecule is what's called the coefficient. And you might recognize that term from math class. The coefficient is the number right before the variable. So like 6x would tell you that, well, you have 6 what? 6 x's. And in this case, you'd say you have 6 water molecules. And down here, these other little numbers that are in a chemical formula are what are called subscripts. Sub means below, like a submarine or a subway or a sub-zero temperature. And script, of course, just means writing. So below the writing, so if you look at this below the writing, these little tiny numbers down here are below the writing. And these simply tell you how many, so for instance, a C6 means that you've got 6 carbons, which we've already studied before. So the subscript is just the little numbers here. The coefficient tells you how many of those whole molecules you have. Now, how can you look at this without a bunch of beans and try and figure out how many of each type of atom there are? Well, think of it like H2O. There's your molecule. Think about like putting it in parentheses as if you were in math class. And if you look at this, you go, okay, that means we have 6 water molecules, and here are the water molecules. Okay, 1 oxygen and 2 hydrogens for each one of them. And you go, okay, how many hydrogen atoms are there altogether? Well, each one of these has 2 hydrogen atoms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. How could you get 12 out of a 6 and a 2? Well, you just multiply them, right? So 6 times 2 gives you 12. So without making them out of beans or without drawing out all the molecules, you can simply go, oh, 6 times 2, there's 6 sets of 2 hydrogen molecule or atoms for a total of 12 hydrogen atoms. How about the oxygens? Well, obviously there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the oxygen molecules. You can think of this as having a 1 here, right? We don't write it, but you could. 6 times 1 would give you a total of 6 oxygen atoms. So looking at this, it's kind of like the, I think it's called the distributive property of multiplication, where 6 times this and then 6 times that would tell you the total number of atoms in this number of these molecules. All right, awesome. So here comes Lavoisier to say, let's try and balance this equation for photosynthesis. We've got our reactants over here and our products over here. So 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water. What do we have over here in terms of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens? And we'll compare it to the right side. So 6 carbons, 6 carbon dioxides, this gives you a simple answer of, well, there's 6 of them. Hydrogens, you've got 6 sets of 2 hydrogens, so that would be, that's right, 12 hydrogens. And for oxygens, you'd have to say, okay, we've got 6 over here, pairs of oxygen. So there's 12 oxygens here in the carbon dioxide molecules, and 6 times 1 over here, which would give you 6 oxygen molecules in the water molecule. So a total of 12 plus 6 gives you a total of 18 oxygens. All right, over here on the product side, let's see if they match up. 6 carbons over here, that's pretty easy. How many hydrogens? That's pretty easy, H12, so there's 12 of those. And finally, O6, well, that's just 6, and then 6 O2s. So 6 pairs of oxygen atoms here would be 12, for a total of 6 plus 12, 18. And hey, look at that. Exact same number of each type of atom on both sides. Is this balanced? Absolutely. Antoine Lavoisier is happy. Very nice. Perfectly balanced. Exact same number of each type of atom on both sides. Now, when we look at this, we got to think of it as, here are the ingredients, carbon dioxide, water molecules. And what happens in photosynthesis when light strikes this and when all this stuff is present inside the chloroplasts of a leaf in a plant, what happens is the bonds are broken and these atoms then are rearranged and form new bonds to make new molecules. That's right, a new substance with new properties over here on the product side. Okay, so the idea is simply that you start with a bunch of atoms arranged in a certain way into various molecules, and then when the chemical reaction happens, whatever kind of chemical reaction it is, this happens to be photosynthesis, you simply have those bonds broken, and all those atoms are accounted for over here on the product side. They are just rearranged into new molecules. None of these atoms left, none of them that were created out of nowhere. Matter was not created nor destroyed. It just rearranged the atoms. And that's what happens in a chemical reaction. Now, what does that look like in real life? If life looked like a cartoon. Well, carbon dioxide's floating around in the air. We've got 6 of those. We're short a few trillion, but we're going to keep to simple numbers that we can count. And we also need water. That's going to come from the sky, of course. Precipitation falls, and the water soaks into the soil. Water generally doesn't just go right into a leaf and into a tree that way. It goes into the soil, and the tree gets it from down there. And now we have carbon dioxide, we have water, but they're not in the same place. So where do they need to meet? Where is the factory where we actually produce this stuff? Well, it doesn't happen in the roots, because that's underground. It wouldn't get much sunlight. It happens in the leaves of a tree, and particularly in the green parts in the cell called the chloroplasts, which contain that substance called chlorophyll, which makes them green. So if we can get all that carbon dioxide pulled into the leaf, and it does that through little tiny openings in the leaf called stomata, and then if we can pull that water from the soil through the roots, up through the stem, and conveniently all into that same giant leaf, what you end up with then is all this stuff in one place. So photosynthesis, it's happening, it's not happening. Why is it not happening? Oh, we need one more thing. It's not a reactant. There's no atoms involved in this thing, but it's the energy source that makes this all happen. That's right, we need some light. And so the light comes in, and bam, you've got photosynthesis. You've rearranged now all of those atoms, and there they are. They're all rearranged. Can you see it? Not very well. So let's clean out some of the waste molecules that are made. There's oxygen. They pair up and float off. There's 6 pairs of oxygen that float off into the atmosphere. And what we have left now, this guy right here, looks a lot like sugar. So the oxygen is a waste product in the air. Plants do not need oxygen. They just get rid of it. They're not trying to make it for us. They're not trying to help us out. They're just getting rid of these extra atoms that they don't need. Meanwhile, what they're really going after is sugar. That's right, the glucose, C6H12O6, they're trying to make that. And here's what that thing looks like. The whole point of photosynthesis is really to build these, glucose. Plants are not trying to make oxygen for us. They're trying to make sugar for themselves so they can build themselves bigger, so they can reproduce, so they can defend themselves, so they can make new leaves and roots and all of that. That's the whole point of photosynthesis. Now, what's cool about this, photosynthesis, if you think about it, carbon dioxide plus water, add in some light energy, which isn't really a reactant at all. It's just the energy that gets this process going. It's not made of atoms, right? You do this and you get sugar, and the plant makes sugar and then produces a bunch of extra oxygen, which it lets off. What the amazing thing about this, though, is that we do something very similar to this, except in order to show what we do, you've got to spin those arrows around. We take sugar, combine it with oxygen, those are our reactants, and then what happens? Well, we do what's called respiration. Respiration is not just breathing. Respiration is taking oxygen and combining it with the sugar in the food that we eat, and we just break down all of our food into simple sugars. And what happens is we get a whole bunch of energy out of it. Instead of putting energy in, we get energy out. The arrow's going the other way now. So we get thermal energy to keep us warm, kinetic energy to keep us moving, And then as products, in terms of what happens to the atoms, they get rearranged, and we produce carbon dioxide and water. And if you breathe out onto your hand, that's carbon dioxide, and you'll feel the water vapor as well coming out of your body. So what we've got here is two processes that are kind of the opposite of each other. Plants take carbon dioxide and water, and through photosynthesis, the arrow goes this way and makes sugar and oxygen. We then take oxygen, we take the sugar, in fact, usually in the plants that have produced it, we eat part of a plant, and respiration happens, we respire, and we give off water and carbon dioxide, which the plants then can use to photosynthesize, to make stuff that we can use to respirate, and so on. It's a circle. The circle of life. Yeah. So what does that look like? You're out there, you see an apple on a tree. You've got sugar. Essentially, apples are generally mostly have fructose in them, which is a more complex form of sugar, but a fairly simple sugar as it goes. And we come along, we eat the apple, so we consume that sugar, and in the presence of oxygen, which we also then breathe in, that burns calories. And when I say it burns calories, I mean it really burns calories, and it gives you energy. And as a waste product then, we give off carbon dioxide and water, which the plant can then use, carbon dioxide and water. It can take energy from the sun and repeat the process and grow another apple and produce more oxygen, and it goes and goes from there. The whole purpose of respiration is not to make carbon dioxide and water for the plant. The purpose of respiration is right here, energy. We're trying to get energy. The interesting thing, actually, plants also go through respiration. They use that sugar, they burn that sugar that's in them, and so the stem of a plant, the roots of a plant, they actually also do respiration. Little known fact, actually. Most people think plants only do photosynthesis. But all animals do respiration. They consume food, they consume sort of fuel, generally made from a plant, or if not a plant, then something that ate a plant. And then we burn that in the presence of oxygen for energy. Now, here's another way you can use a plant. You can take that sugar that the plant has then converted into a more complex form of wood, cut that down, add a little bit of heat, and add some oxygen. If you have fuel, heat, and oxygen, you have a flame, you have combustion happening. So you can take oxygen and the sugar from the tree, essentially burn that, and it produces a lot of energy and gives off, you guessed it, carbon dioxide and water. I know it seems weird to think that a fire produces water, but it does. It actually combines the hydrogen from the sugars in the wood, the hydrocarbons in the wood, and combines it with the oxygen in the air that it's using to burn, and it produces water. It doesn't put the fire out because the water is in the form of water vapor. But look at this. This looks pretty familiar, doesn't it? Yes, it does. It looks familiar. It does look familiar because we do the exact same thing. We burn calories, just like a campfire would burn wood, to make energy. And what do we give off as byproducts? Carbon dioxide and water. So essentially, what we are doing is almost the exact same thing as burning. So when we say we're burning calories, we really are. We really are doing that. So photosynthesis and respiration are opposite processes. You could take respiration and replace it with the word combustion, and it's essentially the same thing. You're taking some sort of fuel, combining it with oxygen, and it gives off water and carbon dioxide. Pretty cool. So respiration or combustion, either one could go right there in that diagram. And if you take a look at this, photosynthesis requires energy. So it's taking in energy, it needs energy. That is a process that we would say is endothermic. And think about combustion or respiration. Do they take in energy or do they give energy? Well, they give off a lot of energy, actually. And so these processes would be labeled exothermic. It's a cycle of endothermic in photosynthesis and exothermic in combustion or respiration. And those are the chemical processes, the chemical reactions that are driving most life on Earth, which is us. Thanks for watching.